true. I'm going to be reading from the book of Matthew. If you want to take your Bibles and turn there, we're going to be relating to a scripture found in Matthew 25. And so I want you to be able to read along with us. It's found in around the 31st verse or so there. Amen. I've called this message today, Lord, when did we see you? My sister-in-law was in took her husband to the doctor, Sister Teresa's sister and brother-in-law. She took him to the doctor to have some things done on his eyes and other things. He's having some medical problems, so when you pray for Spanky. But they left there and they went to one of the local restaurants there. While they were there, she said there were people in the lobby, and an elderly black lady came in with a bag. And she, of all the people there, she walked up to Brenda and she said to her, "I'm hungry. Would you buy me a meal?" And said she just saw something different in her she hadn't seen before. She turned to her and said, "Sure, I will. Just tell the lady what you want, and I'll buy your meal for you." And so she bought her meal, and the lady quietly just ate and slipped out. She said, "I didn't hear from her anymore." She said, "But even as I write this, I asked her to write the story, and I'm sure I didn't get it correct all the way, but I asked her, I said, write me the story and send it to me." And she said, "Even as I write it, I still cry today." And that's kind of what we're talking about today. There was a man by the name of Martin of Tours who was a Roman soldier and a Christian. One day, one cold winter day, he was entering into a city, and a beggar stopped him and asked him for help. I think the slide is coming up any minute. Martin had no money, and the beggar was blue and shivering with cold, and Martin gave him what he had. He simply took off his soldier's coat, worn and frayed as it was, took his sword, cut it in half, and gave half of it to the man. That night, Martin had a dream. And in that dream, he saw heavenly places with angels all around, and Jesus was among them. And Jesus was wearing half of a Roman soldier's coat. One of the angels said, "Master, why are you wearing that old and tattered coat? Who gave it to you?" In which Jesus very softly replied, "My servant Martin gave it to me." The story of the text that I just talked to you is when Jesus said, "And when you've seen these and done the least of these to those, you've done it unto me." In other words, we see Jesus all the time. We see him in our everyday experience. Now, I will tell you, like I told the early church service this morning, this was a service or a sermon that was tough on me because I have spent a lifetime trying to build up walls to say, you just have to keep your distance. I don't ever want to be taken. In fact, you may remember a few weeks ago I preached a sermon called Scammed, where I talked about how people can scam you and all. And when I was preparing this message, I said something to Donnie, our music pastor, about it. I said, "This is funny, I'm preaching this, and it's hard for me to preach it." He said, "Yeah, on the heels of the one you preached called Scammed." And I don't want to be scammed. And maybe that's the reason I've built up these walls where I've kept people at bay, and I didn't want to be taken advantage of. And so it's been a difficult time for me. This is a hard sermon for me. When I preached it, when I wrote it, when I preached it today, it still hit home with me, and it does in this second service as well. Because we see, or we should, see the face of Jesus in homeless people, in sick people, in deranged people, in the hungry people, in the stranger people, in the elderly people, in the children that we see, we ought to be seeing Jesus. We ought to be able to see who he is and see the face of him. But because of this, we probably will never look at another person in the same way again. At least for me, this sermon changed the way I look and view at people. When we see those people who are down and out, sleeping on the streets, we're looking at Jesus. When we see someone who is being ugly to someone who maybe cut them off in traffic, we're often looking into the eyes of Jesus rather than the infuriated face of a person. When we see the picture of one of those people on the cover of a magazine in a kind of a convenience store or something, oftentimes we're looking in the face of Jesus. Now, I had not recently viewed it in that same way. And now, when I do, I look down at them, and I look down at them in a different way. Before, if we're not careful, the way we look down into their faces, we often look down with a maybe a measure of arrogancy. I'm better than you. I have more than you. We look down at them, and we don't have the empathy that Jesus would have, or the mercy or the love. And I've been talking to the Lord about this. I decided that in my older age, getting in your 40s is tough. I decided it's not about how well you think I preach. It's not about me getting up here and just impressing you. It's more about me leaving something in your lives for you to take home that will change you and make you to be more like who Jesus is. And that's really the key here, church. Church is for us to learn. It's for us to become more of the servants that Christ wants us to be, living like he wants us to do. So when I began to look at this sermon and get everything down, I'm like, God, you are wearing me out. This is not my kind of sermon. This is a kind of sermon that takes its toll on me. But this is what this parable comes down to. You know that a lot of people, you may not know, scholars don't consider this to be a parable. That's why I referred to it as a story. They don't consider it to be a metaphor for something else like the parable of the sower or the parable of the talents. More other people consider this that Jesus is telling a story. In fact, most other parables, Jesus starts with, the kingdom of heaven will be like, and so he likens it. This passage begins to talk to us about different things. In fact, in this passage, it talks about the sheep and the goats, and it begins to say, and when the Son of Man comes in his glory with all of his angels with him, will he find this inside of you? And so this is kind of Jesus' last lecture, his last final teachings in the book of Matthew. And I've got to think to myself, surely he has saved the best for last. He's got it down to where he wants us to understand this is the important things. This is the one thing that you need to get before you move on through. If you're to look through the New Testament, you'll find that this passage that we're looking at this morning is the only description that we find on the last judgment, or what we call the final judgment. And there is one criteria in all of this that we find, and it's whether or not we see Jesus living in other people's lives. If we see his face in the needy, or whether or not we gave ourselves away to save or love in his name, is all the criteria that he has here for the final judgment. I mean, it makes sense to me. That's what he's talking about. This is not fluff. This is real life. This is more about us becoming more like Christ. And that's what he wants us to become, is his disciples, which is, and you use the word disciple or discipline, then that's what he's trying to do to us. So in this final stretch of my life, whatever that may be, I want to become more like Christ. And it makes me aware when I read passages like this that I have avoided most of my time, is because I am not much more like Christ. I am much less than looking like him than I want to be. Now, you can save your pious judgment to get on yourselves when you get home. But for me, that's the case. What did Jesus tell us was the final commandment? Well, the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord thy God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and body. And the second was love thy, you got it, love thy neighbor as thyself. And then he added something to that. He said, and all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. I was talking to someone in a restaurant not long ago in a breakfast time, and I said something. He said something about the 10 Commandments, and I said, well, in the New Testament, Jesus brought these down. He concised them to just 2. He said, 2? And he looked rather bewildered at me. And I said, sure. He said, what are they? I said, it's easy. Jesus narrowed them all down so we wouldn't have to list a whole 10 commandments and go over every one of them. He narrowed them down and said, love the Lord thy God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and body, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, and the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. In other words, everything in the Bible hang on the 2 commandments that he gave to us. It covers everything. It's not I don't have to steal or I don't have to kill. It's that if I love God more than I love anything else, I love him more than I do my family, more than I do my job, more than I do money, more than I do anything else. If I love him more and then I love my neighbor as myself, I've covered it all. It brings me to the place he wants me to be. He's brought me to that place. I think Jesus is saying this in this passage, what he had been saying his whole ministry. I went back, and if you follow him and his teachings and the things he did, he was always helping somebody. He was always striving to bring somebody up off the mat of despair. He was always reaching out to someone who was less fortunate. And even when people would ridicule him, and there I go back to my sermon on scam, sometimes I've become so afraid of being scammed that I haven't allowed myself to be a blessing that God wanted me to be, because I was so afraid somebody was going to get the better of me. I don't know where that came from in my life, but it's a part of it. And I struggle with it all the time. And so when I see Jesus doing all of these things, and then it culminates in his very own body on the cross, where he gives everything to us and proves to us that God loved us more than anything in the world, all of a sudden, I realize that he identifies to us fully and completely as our neighbors. So we are to recognize God most easily in the face of our neighbors. Loving your neighbor. What does that mean? Your person next door? I think it means anybody that we come in contact with, that we're to see the best in them. I haven't done that my whole life, and I regret that, because I probably missed some great opportunities to see Jesus. Seeing him in the face of others. So when I'm loving my neighbor, then I'm loving God. And when I'm not loving my neighbor, then I'm not loving God, because he plainly tells us, if we meet people who are engaged in abusive behavior towards another person, maybe at school, guys, bullying, treating an employee like a slave, then that's how we are indeed treating Christ. If we're holding hatred in our hearts towards another person, well, you get the picture here. It's all about how that God teaches us to love one another, love God and love one another. And so, for the Christ follower, those of us that are sitting in this room today, there's no room in our lives for discrimination. There's no room for hatred, no room for holding grudges, no room for judgments. All of a sudden, I realize that God hasn't called me to be boss. He hasn't called me to be judge and jury. He hasn't called me to dictate what other people have to do as much as He's called me to love them. So it all fits. Everything Jesus has taught fits. The only thing there is room for is the love of God. You say, somebody will take advantage of me. My thoughts exactly. That's why I've always been that way. That's not a good way to be. You mean, Pastor, we just got to be gullible? I don't think Christ means for us to be gullible, but He certainly means for us to try to see the best in others, the love that God has for them, and seen through Christ. Now, that's easier said than done. It's been a hard walk for me, but that's why Jesus tells us pray for our enemies, to give food and drink to those that despitefully use us. In doing so, we're serving Christ. Let me tell you something I told the earlier church. People out there aren't devils. There is only one devil. Last time I checked, just one. Now, he may have a lot of friends. He may have a lot of companions, but there's only one devil. All the people out there still have an opportunity to be redeemed. And it's our job to show the love of Christ. Those people are fallen and lost creatures who've been created in the very image of God to be loved and to be redeemed. You know, it's funny that He said, love me, love the Lord thy God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and body, and love your neighbor as yourself, to know that all of those neighbors, including us, have been identified in the image of Christ, and therefore He says, show them and find them in people that you meet every day. Find that love. We're told in 1 John chapter 4, Jesus said, if anybody loves God and yet hates his brother or his sister, then he's a liar. All of a sudden you go, uh-oh. Well, I don't really, I love this. I don't really hate them, but our actions show differently than that, and we really find ourselves doing that. We find ourselves becoming liars. That's some heavy stuff. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, that whatever you did for the least of these, you did it for me. So all of a sudden, He takes away all our ability to judge, all of our ability to say, well, I don't want to get scammed like the pastor said. It takes away all of that and gives us the opportunity to do what's right. There was a little boy who wanted to meet God. And so one day he knew it was a long trip. At least he decided it was a long trip to meet God. And so he packs his backpack. He's full of cupcakes and root beer. And he starts out on his journey to meet God. He's gone about 3 blocks and he's a little bit tired already. He sees an elderly woman sitting on a bench and watching the pigeons. And so the boy sits down next to her and he opens his backpack. And he's about to take a drink from one of the root beer cans when he notices that the lady beside him looks hungry. And so he offers her a cupcake, and gratefully she accepted it and just gave him the biggest old smile. Her smile was so wonderful that he wanted to see it again, so he offered her some root beer this time. And so when she got the root beer, she again gave him a great big smile. That little boy was happy. It made him excited. They sat together all afternoon, eating cupcakes, drinking root beer, and just smiling at each other. No conversation, no talk. It started to get dark. The little boy decided he was tired, needed to go home. And so he got up to leave, but before he'd gone maybe 3 or 4 steps, he turned and wheeled around and ran back to the woman, threw his arms around her, just gave her the greatest big hug you ever seen, and she just gave him the biggest smile ever. When the little boy got home, his mother was surprised by the look of happiness and joy on his face, and so she said, "Hey, what made you so happy today?" And he replied, "Oh, I just had lunch with God." Before the mother could respond, the little boy added quickly, "You know what? She had the biggest smile, most beautiful smile in the whole world." Meanwhile, the elderly woman, too, went home. When she walked in, her son noticed that her face was radiant. She was joyful and happy. He was kind of stunned by the look of peace on her face, and he asked his mother, "What made you so happy today?" She replied, "Oh, I ate a cupcake with God in the park today." I asked myself this question a lot this week. Have I seen Jesus lately? And I tried to think, because we like look for Jesus and we want to see a ta-da. We want lights to shine and star to rise above their head, something that identifies them as Jesus, something that makes us go, "Oh yeah, that's Jesus." But often, like my sister-in-law, it may be nothing more than a humble, small, frail little black lady who said, "I'm hungry. Can you buy me lunch?" I'm so sad to tell you that there's many times I would have bought their lunch, but there's many times I would have thought, am I just getting scammed? Then I realized one day, it's not my judgment call. It's mine to see Jesus and do the works of Christ, and it's God to hold accountable. And so, if we could only, as church people, if we could only begin to see Jesus in everybody we meet, how would that change our life? How would it change the world if our leaders started seeing Christ in everybody? How would it change our attitudes towards blowing people up or bombs in a neighborhood? Or how would it work with our street gangs? If you're saying, "But Pastor, you're just living in a fantasy land." I don't know, but that's what Jesus said. That we're to give that kind of love and see that kind of love in everyone. And so that's kind of become my goal this year. It's become more that I can seek to reach that goal of loving people. It's something, it's just something worth me asking God for every day. Lord, help me to see Jesus in people that I meet. I realize that there's an opportunity to make a mistake, but I would think there's more of an opportunity to make a real treasure. There was, I don't know if you remember the old upper room devotionals. We used to give them out at church. People used to have them all the time. There was one where a man named Bill Roy wrote, one day while watching news on the TV, he said, "I saw a pitiful scene of a woman, frail, clutching a little baby, an infant who was starving to death." And he said, I kind of called out to God and I said, "How can you be a loving and compassionate and caring God? How can you allow this?" He said it was just a second when suddenly an image of a tearful God holding that woman and that child who was starving to death looked at me and said, "If you're my disciple, how can you allow this?" Bill said since that day, he started praying a different way, a new way. Instead of complaining to God, he now seeks God's will for his life as it relates to helping others who are suffering. He has, he said, had a literal change of life in him. And when you and I look into the face of this community, we look into the face of the world, we have to see Christ. We are transformed to do that. I mentioned, and we had a slide on our announcements announcing the shoe boxes for Jonathan Brown, and I thought about him in the morning service, and I said to him, he's been in Savannah for over 20 years, wiping the noses of little snotty-nosed children, loving on people that are loveless, homeless, down and out, giving food, supplying food, while all the time struggling to make ends meet because he lives off of whatever churches donate towards him. And yet, I never seen him frown. There's been one time he called me and said, Pastor, I need to talk. And we took off and met somewhere and had coffee together. And he was kind of out and down, but he wasn't there long before he was back up, ready to go again, because it's a tough ministry. But he does what I've been unable to do, and that's see the face of Jesus in all of the world. When I look at it differently, like I'm supposed to, then I believe my life is transformed. I believe life becomes new. I believe that enemies become those who are now someone who we love and pray for, and selfishness turns into selflessness, and helping others becomes almost a second nature. I told you, this sermon just wore me out because I haven't been that good. Oh, I'm a giver. I'm a giver. I give all the time. But sometimes I don't look for that opportunity that allows me to be and see the face of Jesus, even when it doesn't come in terms of giving or doing. Because when we're helping others and one another, when we're loving one another, we are in all reality loving and helping Christ. Church has got to be more than come to church and sing a few songs and go home and feel very pious about yourself. I'm really good. I went to church today. I'm good. But rather go home and say, how can I be like Jesus? What's the criteria? What's the formula that I go home and be like Jesus? And it comes to that when we know Christ, when we come to know him through loving and helping and working with other people. You know, Jesus said in the same book in Matthew, back in chapter 7, Jesus said in that chapter, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom. Y'all remember that? Will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. But he goes on to say, but those who do the will of my Father who is in heaven. It's funny to me that in chapter 25, when he talks about how that we're to love those who are less fortunate, we're to reach out to those, we're to see God's face, Christ's face in all of those, he goes on to tell us at the end of that thing, that is the will of God. So we find here in Matthew 25, that's the will of God, that we love one another, that we treat people in such a way that we're doing for Christ in the same measure. We find that we are to feed the hungry, and we're to give drink to the thirsty, and we're to make friends with the stranger, and we're to clothe the naked, and we're to look after the sick and visit those who are in prison. Last time I checked, going to the hospital was not just a pastor's job, but it belongs to all of us to see after those who are sick, to watch after those who are needy, to look around our church, to look around our neighborhood and go, hey, I know this person needs something. And you don't have to make a big broadcast about it. You don't have to sound off the trumpets and balloons. You just have to do what you would do. And you know it's Jesus. And doing this, I think we look straight in the eyes of Christ. And when we think about it, everybody's hungry. Everybody's thirsty, everybody's lonely, everybody's naked and in prison, whether it is literally or figuratively, whether it is spiritual hunger or spiritual thirst or naked and in prison by sin, death, and hell, or whether it is without real or tangible food or drink or clothing or so forth, it is still doing it unto Jesus. But Pastor, what if it's not Jesus? But his indication here is that it is, no matter who it is. Just because there's not a ta-da moment or a light flashing in the heavens or a star shining doesn't mean that it's still not doing it unto them as doing it unto Christ. And so in knowing this, we cannot ever look another human being in the face the same way again. In writing and getting ready to preach today, I almost that's funny, y'all. I almost dreaded preaching this week because I'm preaching so much to myself. I'm preaching to me. I'm talking to David Riner. It's not that I'm not friendly or kind or considerate or giving. I think that I'm all of those things. But maybe I have been able to pick and choose rather than see the face of Jesus in everybody I meet. Doesn't mean I have to empty my pocketbooks every time. It might mean a glass of water, or it might mean a help, or it might mean a lift in a car, or it might whatever. Many of us kind of picture that last judgment scene of Christ because he talks about this in Matthew 25 a little bit. It tells us about what Jesus tells us that it's not about what we have done or not done for others along the way. It's how we've responded to people in view of him. It's amazing to me how easily it is for us in the church world to reduce our judgment to a lot of do's and don'ts that we use to judge one another and sometimes ostracize one another. But it's about doing the things that Christ has left us to do. When I get down to the end of this thing, I don't want to be left holding something and going, well, I should have or I could have. I want to get to the end of this thing and hear him say to me, you've done a good job. I appreciate what you've done. For what you did for others, you did for me. That's the whole niche here, isn't it? There was a man one time who was born wealthy and kind of a high-spirited, but he wasn't happy. He wasn't happy at all. He felt a void in his life. He felt like life was somewhat incomplete. So one day he met a leper. And when he met that leper, he found his disease to be disgusting and repulsive. But something moved him. Moved him to get down off of his horse, go over to that man, fling his arms around him. And in the arms, he watched the face of Christ appear where the face of the leper was. That man, that's how this rich and empty man by the name of Francis become later known as the Saint Francis of Assisi, because he loved the leper. So what Christ is asking us to do, and I don't know, maybe Christmas brought it on, I don't know. But maybe he's asking us to leave here today and to meet people, and no matter sometimes how dirty they seem to be, how smelly or diseased, or whether it's beyond the reach of those who seek Christ in the face of others, is to see them as what Christ is, and know that when I'm doing something to them, I'm ministering to them, I'm doing it for him. And then I hear the words of Jesus, truly I say unto you, whatsoever you did not for one of the least of these, you didn't do it for me. So I ask myself, final question again. Have you seen Jesus lately? You know, I think back over just the last months or so and wonder how many times I missed him. How many times I failed to see him because either I was too busy, too pious, too unwilling to get scammed, that I missed the opportunity to look into the face of Jesus. Me and Mike laugh sometime. There's pictures of Jesus. Mike said, yeah, don't he look just like his picture? We don't have a real knowing way of seeing who he is, except to know that we see him every day in the face of others, in the lives of people, in the cries of their hunger, in their children and their babies. We see the face of him. And the world is filled with the hungry and the thirsty and the imprisoned and the lonely and those who mostly feel like nobody cares. And it's God's call on our lives to love others as God loved us. First few times I ever traveled out of the United States, I remember seeing the faces of those people that were without much. I ate in homes where there wasn't even a kitchen table. I told you one time I sat on the hood of a man's car, and he was the richest man in the church, and ate breakfast. It was in his house. I remember the children that would run up to us hungry. And I remember what it did to me. I remember that. And I came home, and I was going one day from my house, I think, to the hospital, and I had to pass this new church that had just been built. It was probably, and this has been 40-some years ago probably, and it had just been built, and at that time probably cost in excess of $10, maybe $15 million back then. And one guy in that town wrote the check out for that church. I found myself driving by it, all of a sudden overwhelmed. I couldn't stop weeping. I had to pull my car over to the side of the road. And I remembered the clash between that gazillion-dollar church and the faces of all those people that I'd just seen 2 weeks prior to that. And I was overwhelmed. That's one way. But I don't want Jesus to let it be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I want him to teach me how to become his servant, to see his face in everybody I meet, to do what I can to show the love of Christ. Because me, that's better than somebody thinking me I'm something in a church, or I'm something because of whatever. I'm just something because I want to be like Jesus. Man, this is a deep sermon. I understand that. I just want to be like Jesus. And I want our church to be like that. Father, thank you for the opportunity to break my heart one more time, to make me think about what I haven't thought about lately, the face of Jesus in the hearts and the faces of all the people that I meet. Help me find ways, not just to give away money or to do certain things, but really look for your face. I somehow think that you're God enough to be able to show me that you're God enough to help me understand that what I'm looking at is the face of Jesus. And that I can be a difference, make a difference. Whether I'm a child at school or an adult at work, whether I'm walking the streets or in the mall or in a restaurant, help me always to be on lookout. Because I believe that somewhere there, I'll find you. And I want you to say to me, you did it to the least of these, so you've done it to me. And see Jesus in everyone I meet, in every way that I come to. Change this church to be like that. That we will see Jesus in each other and in the world itself. Thank you, Lord.